So my portion of the presentation addressed question D. Assume you were hired away from All-Star Brands by Driscoll to become their Columbia country manager. Based on the situation at the end of the simulation, what would you do to improve Driscoll's performance in Columbia based on their strengths and weaknesses? So the first thing that I did was delve into the broad economic data to get a greater understanding of Driscoll's position relative to competitors and just from an absolute perspective. I wanted to look at things like revenue, gross margin, overall contribution, that sort of thing. And Driscoll's actually in pretty good shape. Of the five companies that were in Columbia through period 8, they were the exact median in revenue and possessed about 22.5% market share. They had a really good gross margin of about 47%, which is just overall a healthy figure and the second best of the group. And they had the greatest overall contribution proportion, which was a little bit in excess of 24%. But beyond the broad metrics, it was important to dive into the weeds a little bit. So the first thing that I looked at was the SKUs, or were the SKUs. They sold 8 varieties in period 8. 3 of them were economy options, and 5 of them were healthy options. Of the 3 economy options, 2 of them did well. One actually did very well. It was the industry leader. Then the third variety was absolutely horrendous. It did a terrible job and probably came at a great opportunity cost, which, in real life too, there would be some sort of cost savings just associated with producing fewer SKUs. But I don't think that's very well reflected actually in the software and the algorithm. But so back to the healthy options, there were 5 of those. 4 of them ranged from very poor in performance to okay at best. And then the 5th healthy option actually did pretty well. So of the 8 SKUs, really only 2 were sub-industry dominant, which it is a major weakness to have so many poor performing SKUs, as there is a large opportunity cost. But there is a positive takeaway from the SKU performance that could be a major strength. Only a singular SKU was advertised for. Granted, it was one of the 2 that performed very well, but the single best performing SKU didn't run a single ad. And really, the ad that ran targeted families and had a health benefits message, but the single best performing SKU was an economy option. So naturally, I would identify this SKU as having flagship potential. And if I were truly working at Driscoll, I would concentrate a lot of efforts into just improving the sales associated with that one potential flagship product. Their advertising budget was actually relatively large, even though there was only a single ad set. They spent about 8.5 billion pesos, whereas the next highest competitor, not including All-Star, only spent about 5.4 billion pesos on their entire suite. So this is a good chance to be aggressive if you can just reallocate that 8.5 billion and set aside a large chunk of that towards economy options. But sort of the next topic moving on here to delve into with our limited view were the sales outlets. There were 4 potential outlets: traditional, self-serve, hypermarket, and web/other. Driscoll allocated the vast majority of their resources to traditional, which was fair, granted that 55% of Colombians do their shopping in traditional markets, and they naturally succeeded in the self-serve markets without too much of an effort anyways. But they did completely ignore the hypermarkets. And really the web/other, but the web/other was a tiny portion of an already tiny market. But the hypermarket segment was a little bit over 28% of where Colombians did their shopping. So this was a huge weakness and just a huge miss for them to not at least make some sort of attempt to procure some market share here. On the other end of that, they did do really well in traditional. So some major strengths and weaknesses here. But one more thing to speak to in regards to that is that Colombians care more about price than any other country's inhabitants care about any individual decision criteria, with the exception, I think, of Peruvians in pricing. But it's a tiny difference. It was like with the Colombians, it was 50.7% of their decision criteria was the price. Peruvians was like 50.9%. So really, that may be something worth experimenting with. Driscoll was already very middle of the pack in terms of their average MSRPs across the board. So if these Colombians are as price sensitive as the game would lead us to believe that they are, perhaps in the next few rounds, we may want to experiment with slight price decreases. That didn't bode very well for our group in the live competition, just because gross margin was just such a heavy factor into our overall criteria. But from a practicality standpoint, that could make a lot of sense for Driscoll.